14 films, 14 stories that regimes tried to silence. Some were banned for mocking dictators. Others were buried because they exposed cruelty too honestly. A few were hidden because they were weapons of hatred too dangerous to leave unchecked. What you are about to hear is not just film history. It is a map of fear. Each title reveals what powerful institutions did not want audiences to see. Stay with me. The truth behind suppression is more revealing than any script. Before America officially entered the Second World War, Hollywood was already fighting on screen. In 1939, Warner Brothers released Confessions of a Nazi Spy, directed by Anatole Litvak. It was not fiction disguised as spectacle. It was based on a real espionage case uncovered by the FBI involving Nazi agents operating inside the United States. At a time when many studios avoided open political confrontation, this film took a direct stance against Hitler. The backlash was immediate. German diplomats pressured theaters. Pro-Nazi groups protested outside cinemas. Several foreign markets refused to screen it. The film was banned in Nazi Germany and throughout Axis-controlled territories. Even in neutral nations, exhibitors hesitated. Studio executives feared retaliation against overseas investments. Yet, Warner Brothers moved forward. The movie portrayed American agents exposing a spy ring that sought to weaken democracy from within. It warned audiences that fascism was not a distant European problem, but a creeping threat. What made the film controversial was not violence, but clarity. It named Nazism as the enemy long before Pearl Harbor forced national consensus. That boldness cost it financially overseas. Some exhibitors cut screenings short due to threats. In Germany, the regime denounced it as hostile propaganda. In hindsight, the film appears prophetic. At the time, it felt dangerous. Hollywood rarely risks alienating global markets. In 1939, it did. Confessions of a Nazi Spy stands as one of the earliest cinematic alarms about fascist infiltration. It was suppressed by dictatorships and viewed cautiously by isolationists. Yet, it survived. And its existence proves that sometimes cinema does not wait for history to catch up. But the next film on this list was not a warning about tyranny. It was a weapon created by tyranny itself, and even its own masters feared its power. Judd Seuss was released in 1940 under the direction of Veit Harlan in Nazi Germany. It was not simply a film. It was state-sanctioned anti-Semitic propaganda designed to inflame hatred. Joseph Goebbels oversaw its production. It dramatized the story of an 18th century Jewish financial advisor and twisted history into venomous fiction. The film depicted Jews as manipulative and corrupt in order to justify persecution. It became one of the most widely distributed propaganda films in the Third Reich. Millions were required to watch it. Soldiers saw it before deployment. Civilians saw it in packed theaters. It shaped perception at a time when the machinery of genocide was accelerating. After the war, the film did not quietly fade away. It was banned in Germany and restricted across Europe. Authorities considered it too toxic for general circulation. Even today, access is tightly controlled. Screenings are typically limited to academic contexts with historical framing. The reason is simple. The film was designed to radicalize viewers. It did so effectively. Hollywood did not produce Judd Seuss, yet its legacy forced American studios to confront uncomfortable questions. How powerful is cinema as propaganda? Can images become instruments of violence? After 1945, the film became a cautionary artifact. It was buried not because it lacked craftsmanship, but because its message was engineered to dehumanize. Unlike the previous entry which challenged fascism, this film served it. And that is precisely why it was hidden. Some works are suppressed because they speak truth too early. Others are suppressed because they spread lies too successfully. In 1940, while much of Europe was already under Nazi occupation, one man chose to laugh at Adolf Hitler. That man was Charlie Chaplin. The great dictator was his first true talking picture. It was bold, it was reckless, it was defiant. Chaplin portrayed both a Jewish barber and a tyrant named Adenoid Henkel. The resemblance to Hitler was unmistakable. At the time, the United States was still officially neutral. Isolationism was strong. That many studios feared alienating foreign markets. Chaplin ignored the caution. He invested his own money and reputation into a satire that ridiculed fascist ideology. The film openly condemned anti-Semitism and dictatorship long before America entered the war. The response was explosive. Nazi Germany banned it immediately. Italy followed. Several other Axis-aligned territories prohibited screenings. Even in parts of Latin America, diplomatic pressure limited distribution. Yet there were threats against theaters that dared to show it. Chaplin received warnings that he was endangering himself. Yet the film endured. Its closing speech, where Chaplin breaks character and pleads for humanity, became one of the most famous moments in cinema history. It was not subtle. It was direct moral outrage delivered to the world. After the war, the film remained controversial in certain countries. Some believed satire trivialized horror. Others saw it as courageous foresight. And what cannot be denied is that The Great Dictator was considered dangerous at the time of its release. It mocked a regime that was conquering Europe. That act alone made it a target. This was not a film buried because it failed. It was challenged because it confronted tyranny head-on. But the next film did something more complex. It criticized society during a moment when governments demanded unity. And for that, it too was silenced. Released in 1939, just weeks before France descended into chaos. The Rules of the Game, directed by Jean Renoir, was not a battle film. It did not show tanks or soldiers. Instead, it exposed the moral decay of the French upper class on the eve of catastrophe. The story unfolds in a country estate where aristocrats flirt and betray each other while Europe edges toward war. Audiences were unsettled. Critics were divided. The French government soon banned the film, claiming it was demoralizing to the nation during a time of crisis. Authorities argued that its portrayal of selfish elites weakened public spirit. The film was cut. Prints were confiscated. Its original version was thought lost for years. Why was it considered so threatening? Because it implied that internal corruption and indifference contributed to national collapse. At a moment when patriotism was demanded, Renoir presented hypocrisy. That honesty was uncomfortable. When Nazi forces occupied France, the situation worsened. The film remained suppressed. Only decades later was a restored version assembled from surviving fragments. Today it is often cited as one of the greatest films ever made. Its banning was not about battlefield secrets. It was about morale. Governments during wartime rarely tolerate introspection that questions collective strength. The rules of the game dared to suggest that societal blindness invites disaster. This was not the Titanic you know. This was not a tragic love story set against an iceberg. In 1943, Nazi Germany produced its own version of Titanic under the direction of Herbert Selpin. The purpose was not remembrance. It was propaganda. The film portrayed British greed as the true villain behind the disaster. It suggested that reckless capitalist ambition forced the ship to maintain speed despite warnings. The German officer on board was depicted as honorable and rational. The British elite were shown as arrogant and corrupt. It was a calculated inversion of history designed to undermine Allied moral authority. Production itself became chaotic. Director Herbert Selpin criticized the German military during filming and was arrested by the Gestapo. He died in prison under suspicious circumstances. The film was completed by another director and released selectively. But here is where it turns. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, feared the film might have unintended consequences. Its realistic depiction of mass panic during a sinking ship resembled the crumbling morale within Germany as Allied bombings intensified. Goebbels restricted domestic screenings. The film was shown in occupied territories, but not widely in Germany itself. After the war, Allied authorities suppressed the film due to its overt propaganda and distortion of events. It was locked away. For decades, it remained difficult to access. Today, it is studied as an example of how spectacle can be weaponized. Unlike other entries on this list, which were banned for criticizing tyranny, this film was controlled because it served tyranny too transparently. It reveals how regimes manipulate tragedy for narrative control. And even dictators sometimes fear the emotional impact of their own creations. Now, we move from manufactured spectacle to something more subtle, a romance set during war that many tried to trim, reshape, and censor across borders. Casablanca feels timeless now. It feels inevitable. Yet its journey was not smooth. Released in 1942 by Warner Bros. And directed by Michael Curtiz, the film unfolded against the backdrop of refugees fleeing Nazi-controlled Europe. It was a studio production designed for wartime morale, yet it navigated delicate political terrain. In Axis territories, the film was banned outright. Its portrayal of resistance fighters and corrupt Vichy officials was intolerable to fascist governments. In neutral countries, it faced edits. All scenes were trimmed to reduce overt political statements. Diplomatic sensitivities shaped distribution. Even after the war, the film encountered censorship in various markets. Certain regions cut references to collaboration. Others minimized anti-fascist speeches. Studios often complied to protect foreign revenue streams. Casablanca became a reminder that commercial cinema travels through political checkpoints. What makes its suppression history fascinating is that it never screams propaganda. And it tells a story of love sacrifice and moral awakening. Rick Blaine begins as a cynical businessman who claims he sticks his neck out for nobody. By the end, he chooses resistance over comfort. That arc mirrored what Allied leaders hoped citizens would embrace. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture. It became one of Hollywood's most revered classics. Yet parts of the world attempted to silence it because its message supported Allied unity and condemned fascism. Before the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, there was another kind of battle playing out on screen. In 1939, Frank Capra released Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. On its surface, it is a story about an idealistic young senator who confronts corruption inside the American political system. It is not a war film in the traditional sense, yet its impact during the approach to World War II made it politically explosive. James Stewart plays Jefferson Smith, a naive patriot who discovers that democracy can be manipulated by powerful interests. The film climaxes with a marathon speech defending constitutional principles and individual conscience. In the United States, the movie was controversial. Some politicians argued it portrayed American institutions as weak and dishonest. Yet audiences embraced it as a reaffirmation of democratic resilience. In Nazi Germany, the reaction was swift and absolute. The film was banned. Totalitarian regimes could not tolerate a story in which an individual challenges authority and prevails through moral conviction. The idea that corruption can be exposed through speech and civic courage stood in direct opposition to fascist ideology. Other authoritarian governments followed similar paths of restriction. The film was not suppressed because of battlefield scenes or graphic violence. It was suppressed because it dramatized democracy as self-correcting. That concept threatened regimes built on obedience. What makes Mr. Smith remarkable in this context is that it does not present America as flawless. It presents it as flawed, yet redeemable. That nuance is what dictatorships fear most. A society that acknowledges its weaknesses and still fights for its ideals cannot be easily dismantled. This movie deals with the architecture of freedom itself, and that brings us to a film that faced prohibition for the opposite reason. It attacked nationalism and militarism so fiercely that governments believed it endangered unity. La Grande Illusion, directed by Jean Renoir, arrived before the outbreak of the Second World War. Yet its shadow loomed over everything that followed. Released in 1937, the film tells the story of French prisoners of war during the First World War. It focuses not on combat, but on class divisions and shared humanity across enemy lines. German and French officers converse with respect. Aristocrats recognize each other as members of the same fading world. Ordinary soldiers bond despite uniforms. Renoir suggests that war is sustained by structures of power rather than personal hatred. It is a quietly radical message. Nazi Germany banned the film. Joseph Goebbels reportedly described it as cinematic enemy number one. The reason was clear. The film undermined the myth of heroic nationalism. It portrayed Germans not as monsters, but as complex individuals. At the same time, it rejected blind patriotism. Such nuance did not serve fascist propaganda. Prints were seized. Distribution was blocked across occupied territories. The film survived only because copies were hidden and preserved. During the war years, its absence symbolized the suppression of pacifist voices. In the United States, the film received acclaim and Academy Award nominations. Yet its international journey remained fractured. La Grande Illusion became one of the earliest casualties of ideological censorship during the build-up to global conflict. It does not shout. It does not preach. It simply reveals that enemies share common fears and hopes. That revelation is dangerous in times when governments rely on dehumanization to mobilize populations. After the guns fell silent, another war began. It was not fought with rifles. It was fought inside the minds of returning soldiers. In 1946, legendary director John Huston made a documentary for the United States Army titled Let There Be Light. The film followed American veterans suffering from what was then called combat fatigue. Today we recognize it as post-traumatic stress disorder. Huston did not stage scenes. He recorded real therapy sessions inside a military hospital. Cameras captured trembling hands, blank stares, men who could not speak, men who could not sleep, men who believed they were broken. The film was intended to show that psychological wounds were treatable. It was meant to reassure the public that soldiers could heal. Instead, it terrified officials. The United States government suppressed the documentary almost immediately, and military authorities argued that it could damage public confidence. They feared it would discourage enlistment. They worried it would reveal vulnerability at a time when America projected strength as a global superpower. The result was silence. This was not propaganda. It was not anti-American. It was not fictional exaggeration. It was honesty. That honesty was deemed too raw for a triumphant post-war narrative. Hollywood often celebrates victory with parades and medals. Huston instead showed men shaking in hospital beds, and for that, he was buried. The suppression of Let There Be Light reveals something profound. Governments do not only hide shameful actions, sometimes they hide human fragility. Because admitting the cost of war complicates the myth of glory. And that makes this film one of the most quietly subversive works ever created about World War II. Westfront 1918, directed by G.W. Pabst, was released before the Second World War. Yet it foreshadowed the censorship battles that would follow. The film depicts German soldiers during the First World War, enduring mud-soaked trenches, hunger, and psychological collapse. There is no glamour. There is no heroic score swelling over noble sacrifice. There is exhaustion and despair. When the Nazi regime rose to power, it sought to reshape German identity around strength, discipline, and destiny. Westfront 1918 did not align with that narrative. It portrayed war as wasteful and tragic. Soldiers speak candidly about fear. Civilians struggle at home. The film ends not with triumph, but with quiet devastation. The new regime banned it. Pacifism was branded as weakness. The film's realism threatened the myth of invincibility that propaganda demanded. Prints were suppressed. Public memory was redirected toward militaristic epics. What makes Westfront 1918 compelling today is its stark authenticity. It refuses to romanticize combat. It focuses on individual suffering rather than national glory. That perspective becomes dangerous in systems that rely on myth to mobilize citizens. The earlier entries on this list explored propaganda that fueled hatred. This film represents the opposite force. It questioned the necessity of violence. It asked viewers to see soldiers as fragile human beings rather than symbols. Censorship often reveals what governments fear. In this case, the fear was empathy. Empathy weakens the machinery of war. By banning Westfront 1918, the regime attempted to silence a voice that reminded audiences of the human cost behind uniforms. Now, we shift forward in time, yet remain firmly in the shadow of World War II. The Battle of Algiers, directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, was released in 1966. It does not depict the Second World War directly. It portrays the Algerian struggle against French colonial rule. Yet its techniques and themes are rooted in post-war realities shaped by the global conflict. Shot in a stark documentary style, the film reconstructs urban guerrilla warfare in haunting detail. It shows bombings, interrogations, and brutal counterinsurgency tactics. And French paratroopers use torture to dismantle revolutionary cells. Algerian fighters plant explosives in civilian spaces. There are no clean heroes, only cycles of retaliation. France banned the film for years. Authorities feared it could inspire political unrest and validate insurgent tactics. Screenings were restricted. Debates erupted over whether the film justified violence or simply depicted it with unsettling honesty. In other countries, it faced delays and controversy due to its graphic realism. Why include it on a list connected to World War II? Because the war redrew global borders and ignited independence movements. The Battle of Algiers examines the aftershocks of that upheaval. It reveals how techniques honed during global conflict were repurposed in colonial struggles. The film later gained recognition as one of the most influential political dramas ever made. Military academies studied it. Activists cited it. Governments feared it. Its banning was less about artistic failure and more about political sensitivity. Unlike earlier propaganda pieces, this film refuses to preach. It presents events with clinical intensity and leaves viewers unsettled. That neutrality is what made it dangerous. When cinema mirrors reality too closely, power structures become uneasy. Next, we return closer to the era itself, with a film whose pacifist voice clashed violently with authoritarian doctrine and was nearly erased from cultural history. Some war films explode with spectacle, others whisper their devastation. The Search, directed by Fred Zinnemann and released in 1948, is one of those whispers. Shot partly in the ruins of post-war Germany, the film tells the story of a young boy who survives a concentration camp and wanders through a shattered Europe searching for his mother. An American soldier, played by Montgomery Clift, becomes his unlikely guardian. There are no grand speeches about victory. There are no triumphant marches. The film focuses on displacement, on children who forgot their names, on families torn apart by machinery too vast to comprehend. What made The Search controversial was its unfiltered depiction of refugee camps and administrative failures in the immediate aftermath of liberation. It did not present the Allies as flawless saviors. It showed confusion, bureaucracy, and emotional scars that victory did not erase. In parts of Europe, distribution faced resistance. Certain authorities objected to scenes that emphasized civilian suffering under Allied occupation policies. Some territories delayed release, citing political sensitivity. The film wasn't aggressively banned everywhere, yet it encountered quiet obstruction. Screenings were limited, prints were scarce, conversations were cautious. Why attempt to bury a story about a lost child? Because it refused to let audiences move on too quickly. It insisted that the war's consequences did not end with surrender documents. Trauma lingered in orphanages and railway stations. If earlier entries revealed propaganda and censorship born from fear of dissent, this film reveals something subtler, a fear of prolonged accountability, a fear of confronting the human debris left behind after victory celebrations fade. During the height of the Second World War, Britain needed clear heroes. It needed uncomplicated narratives of courage and resolve. Instead, Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger delivered something far more daring. The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, released in 1943, was not a simple rallying cry. It was a meditation on aging ideals and the moral evolution of warfare. The film follows Clive Candy, a British officer whose life stretches from the Boer War to the Second World War. He begins as a romantic traditionalist who believes in honor codes and gentlemanly conduct. As decades pass, the nature of conflict changes. Total war erodes old assumptions. The enemy no longer follows the same rules. Candy struggles to adapt. Winston Churchill reportedly opposed the film's release during wartime. He feared it portrayed British leadership as outdated. The War Office denied access to military resources during production. There were attempts to limit its influence. Yet Powell and Pressburger persisted. The controversy centered on complexity. Colonel Blimp humanizes a German officer who remains Candy's friend despite political upheaval. It suggests that blind patriotism without reflection can be dangerous. At a time when unity was paramount, such introspection was unsettling. Though not formally banned in Britain, the film faced suppression in certain Allied markets. Distribution was cautious. Some officials viewed it as undermining morale. After the war, its reputation grew. Today it is considered one of the greatest British films ever made. Its temporary sidelining reveals a pattern. Even democracies during war can fear nuance. Stories that question easy narratives may be perceived as threats. Colonel Blimp did not attack Britain. It asked Britain to examine itself. That distinction is subtle yet powerful. Night and Fog, directed by Alain Resnais, is only 30 minutes long. Yet its impact is immense. Released in 1955, it combines color footage of abandoned concentration camps with black and white archival images from the Holocaust. The narration is calm. The imagery is devastating. Though produced a decade after World War II, the film confronted societies still grappling with memory and denial. Some governments hesitated to screen it widely. In West Germany, initial showings were limited due to concerns about reopening wounds. French authorities debated its inclusion in official events because it named collaborators alongside perpetrators. The discomfort was not about ideology. It was about accountability. Night and Fog refuses to allow viewers to distance themselves from atrocity. It shows piles of shoes, hair, and bodies. It asks how such horror became possible. It implies that indifference enables cruelty. In several countries, television broadcasts were postponed or edited. Fake educational institutions debated age restrictions. The film was not banned in the same manner as overt propaganda pieces, yet it encountered barriers because its truth was overwhelming. Unlike earlier entries that were suppressed for political strategy, Night and Fog was constrained by collective unease. Confronting genocide on screen forces societies to acknowledge complicity and memory.